I just want to thank the scientific committee for putting together such an excellent program, I think, in terms of the panel sessions and the oral sessions that I think demonstrate very well the many value issues that come into play in terms of the collection of evidence and how it ought to be synthesized and other considerations as we make an HTAi, produce an HTAi, and feed it into a decision-making process. So I'm going to approach this topic from the HTAi producer's perspective, and what I will say will not be new to some of you in the audience. Nevertheless, I hope I can provide some insight by providing some brief thoughts on what I see as a few of the challenges to considering value issues in HTAi and how they might be addressed. So my time is short. So the previous speakers have mentioned specific values in decision making. I'm not going to be talking about specific values. I'm going to be talking at a relatively high level, partly because of the time. There we go. So first, I just want to note, by reference to some of the titles on the slide that you see at the top of the slide there, that the topic of how to identify and address the many values and value judgments made within HTAi actually isn't that new. There's a large body of literature on this topic already. And so for people who feel that this is a new topic for them, I would encourage you to investigate this large body of literature that's out there already, especially the literature that goes back, in some cases, to the early part of the 20th century and the role of the science advisors in the development of policy. So 3 challenges from the HTAi producer's perspective. And the first one is that HTAi is often described as having 2 parts, right? A collection of the facts and then a collection of the values. And that these pieces somehow proceed independently of one another. And I like to call this the received view of HTAi. But as the received view has it, at the appropriate time, we sort of take these 2 pieces that we've done independently and we somehow clunk them together. So I've crossed this out on the slide, as you can see, because I think that thinking of HTAi in this way, as the adding together of 2 distinct components, is actually particularly unhelpful to us if we want to address the value issues that arise in health technology assessment. Though we may be able to separate these conceptually, right, the facts and the values, in the practice of HTAi, they are, to use a philosopher's phrase, entangled. And some of my colleagues in the ethics interest subgroup who have written on this topic have often talked about facts and values being entwined. And I think that's a very good metaphor for how we ought to think about those things. And the HTAi process ought to reflect this, right? It ought to reflect this entanglement or entwinement of facts and values. Secondly, the production of HTAi involves many values, as the previous speakers have already noted. Right? There are political values, scientific values, epistemological values, ethical values, social values, economic values. And to what extent these values are identified and acknowledged not only influences our ability to determine whether or not the use of a technology might support or undermine the things we hold to be important, it will clearly influence our decision about whether and how a technology ought to be implemented in a health system. And the third challenge actually follows from the second. Right? There are many values at play in HTAi that might be considered in the decision problem, and so there's an issue about the many methods that might be used to identify and think about the relevant value issues and to collect the relevant empirical information that might help shed light on how these values might be reinforced or undermined through a technology's use. And for people who went to the session yesterday on Mythbusters, on gathering evidence for rare diseases, I think that was displayed very well. And I've got a blackbird on my slide. For those of you who are familiar with a very popular textbook on medical ethics in the United States, the authors talk about the ways of looking at a blackbird, 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, which is a reference to a famous American poem. But I think that's a good metaphor for thinking about the many ways in which we might gather information on values in HTAi as well. All right, so the producer is confronted with the difficulty of finding a systematic and transparent way to identify and analyze the many values at play in health technology assessment. Many frameworks for decision-making into which an HTAi feeds have accountability as a main condition of good decision-making, And I think the rigor and transparency of HTAi is meant to support this. But we want to take accountability seriously. So for people to be convinced that a decision is the best course of action, right, it would help for them to be able to assess not only the evidence that's being collected, but also the reasons for the value balancing on which the decision is based. And so here I'm in close agreement with Bjorn Hoffman and others who have argued that an assessment that spells out the relevant moral aspects related to a technology and makes it easy for the reader and decision maker to get a hold of the moral complexity will be better than a health technology assessment that doesn't. And I think that if we want to take the systematic and transparent analysis of identification analysis of values seriously, that a rigorous ethics analysis is the way that we might go about this. And I've got a picture here on the slide of a particular ethical decision-making framework, Good Decisions. It's on there partly because I just like the cover. But this is one that's used in Canada in a jurisdiction there. It's been very popular. Of course, for the audience here in HTAi, the UNETA core model would have been very appropriate as well. They have a very robust and rigorous process, right, by which you can identify ethical issues. It gives you a lot of good guidance on how to conduct ethics analysis and the sorts of questions that you may want to ask yourself if you're trying to take these sorts of issues seriously. I also want to mention that there's a lot of work being done by the HTAi Ethics Interest Subgroup on this matter. And since the inception of HTAi, the Ethics Interest Subgroup, which is currently co-chaired by Dr. Gert-Jan van der Welt and Dr. Vea Ortwin, has been working to further develop ways in which ethical issues might be addressed rigorously, but also in a way that the results are useful to the decision maker. And the interest subgroups have been developing and promoting educational activities such as workshops and presentations to help HTAi researchers and decision makers to better understand what is involved in ethics analysis and what ethics analysis can bring to the practice of HTAi. And this year was no exception. We had a workshop on Sunday afternoon. So I just want to end by saying something about, again from the producer's perspective, about what is required of an HTAi process if we, to promote the identification and thoughtful consideration of values. Right, so the first is that we need an openness to the process and the results of an ethics analysis. We need protected time for a conversation about the ethical issues and their implications. There is this protected time already, at least in, I think in many places, for a discussion about the clinical effectiveness and safety and economic evaluation. But we need to make that time also for the ethical implications. Partly because by conducting the ethics analysis, there will be empirically testable assumptions that you may want to gather further information on and have that feed back into the HTAi. It's also true that by examining the values and asking further questions, considering them thoughtfully, there may be implications for the analysis and the other aspects of HTAi as well. And finally, we need a commitment to respectful engagement with the issues. And by respectful engagement, what I mean is just a commitment to take the issues seriously, separating the people from the positions they take on issues, and treating the individuals involved in these conversations with kindness and respect, regardless of the differences in power that might exist between them. And if we don't do this, then I think our attempts at democratic decision-making are going to look pretty superficial. And that's what this slide is to help us to see, I think. As well, I just want to point out with some of the work that Dr. Littlejohns has done on the development of a social values framework, I think there's a lot of affinity here between the two. This process that I'm describing sounds very much like the sort of process he's describing. Of course, but they're at different levels. 감사합니다.